Now, look, pause for a second. I get there are partisan differences between both sides. And in an election, Republicans like things that help Republicans, Democrats like things that help Democrats. That's the nature of politics. Anyone remotely concerned about free speech or civil liberties ought to be concerned about the FBI asking big tech weeks before an election to take down information because it's politically harmful to the party they want to prevail. And by the way, it's worth underscoring, we now know the Hunter Biden laptop story was true. Not only was it not misinformation, not only was it not Russian misinformation, which is what the FBI falsely claimed, it was true, it was accurate, it was real. Nonetheless, both Facebook and Twitter said take it down, and they demanded of the New York Post. They deplatformed a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton with the 5th largest circulation in the country. They deplatformed the New York Post as long as they kept it up. Now, if you care about journalism, big tech operating at the behest of the FBI to interfere in an election ought to scare the hell out of you. So, when I look at this question, what is preeminent to me is whether this bill is going to increase or decrease censorship. I've got a series of amendments which I intend to offer this morning. And whether I vote yes or no on this bill is going to depend on what happens on those amendments. And I will say this to the authors of the bill. For most of us here, this is not our first rodeo. We've been through a markup. I understand often the authors of a bill circle the wagons and say, okay, any amendment that does anything significant, we're against. We got our bill, we want to force it through. And it's not that hard to count noses in this markup. I think right now, if this bill comes to a vote, you get most or all of the Democrats. Maybe one or two exceptions, but you're going to get almost every Democrat. And you'll get at least a handful of Republicans. That'll be enough to pass it. That will get over the majority threshold. So that if the objective today is to move this bill out of committee, you probably got the votes. That being said, I think whether or not the authors of this bill take the amendments I've authored, whether or not the authors of this bill are willing to do something meaningful to prevent partisan censorship and silencing of free speech online and in the media, I think will determine whether this bill has any realistic prospect of passing on the floor. Because a narrow vote out of committee, I think, the panel was entitled How Activism Informs Policy. And one of the panelists there suggested that police officers kill unarmed black men every day. Now, there's a technical term for that statement. That's called a lie. It's not even kind of sort of right. It is wildly, totally false. During her nomination hearing, she was asked about a tweet that came from that event which said that she had agreed with the statement that police officers kill unarmed black men every single day. At first, she claimed she couldn't remember making the statement. Then later in the same hearing, she claimed she did make the statement. But she did so, quote, as an advocate. She said so 3 separate times. Well, I just, did it as an advocate. Now, most of the members of this committee have practiced law. The last I checked, as an advocate, you have an obligation not to lie. And that is a brazen lie that is dangerous. Now, subsequently, she sent a follow-up letter after her hearing saying, oh, never mind, I didn't say it. The thing that she had justified as, oh, I said it as an advocate. Afterwards, she sent a letter and said, no, actually, I didn't say it. Republicans on this committee asked for a follow-up hearing to ask about her miraculous new memory post-hearing that she didn't say such a harmful thing to police officers across the country. Sadly, the chairman wouldn't give us a new hearing. Another of the judges being considered today, Kenley Kia Cato. At her hearing, I asked her a very simple question. Is racial discrimination wrong? She was utterly unable to answer it. Today's Democrat Party embraces racial discrimination, believes that discriminating based on race, the reason, Mr. Chairman, and you are smirking, but the reason she couldn't answer it is because in law school, she had written an article advocating racial discrimination against Asian Americans. Now, Ms. Cato is Asian American. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the article in front of me, but she essentially said that Asian Americans who didn't support explicit racial discrimination against Asian Americans weren't sufficiently woke. They weren't sufficiently enlightened. Now, I think that's a noxious position. But that's, of course, why she couldn't answer that racial discrimination was wrong, because she is an advocate for racial discrimination. Another one of the nominees being considered this morning is Dale Ho. Dale Ho is a self-described, quote, wild-eyed sort of leftist. Now, let me be clear. That's not my terminology. That's how he describes himself. He says, I am a, quote, wild-eyed sort of leftist. He wrote about how he's motivated each day by his hate for conservatives. That's the word he used, hate. Now, I want you to pause for a second and imagine. I'm going to ask the Democrat members of this committee to do something, which is imagine you're in somebody else's shoes. Engage in empathy. There are actually conservatives in the state of New York. Now, the Democrat governor of New York said to Republicans in New York, you're not New Yorkers, get the hell out, go to Florida where you belong. There's an arrogance to telling your voters that. But it's one thing when you're an elected official if you want to demonstrate that kind of arrogance, but one would think that a federal judge has a different obligation. So I would ask the members of this committee, imagine for a second you were a Republican. Imagine for a second you were a conservative who happened to live in New York City. And you look up in New York City on the federal bench and you see a judge who's described himself as a wild-eyed sort of leftist, his own words, who is motivated every day, who gets up every day, and what gets him going is his hatred for you. You know, this is the kind of fellow that should have worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's the kind of radicals who this administration is nominating, and yet that is not the kind of person that should be a federal judge. And I'm going to talk about one final nominee that isn't before us today, but that will be soon, which is Charnel Beckelgren. Now, the members of this committee are aware of just how wildly unqualified this nominee was. She's been nominated to be a federal district judge, and our colleague, Senator Kennedy, whose cross-examinations on this committee have now become legendary, he asked her what Article 5 of the Constitution was. And she responded saying, well, she couldn't remember, she wasn't familiar with that. He then asked her what Article 2 of the Constitution was. And she said, well, that's not coming to mind either. It was a stunning display of her lack of qualifications to be a federal judge. Now, to be clear, asking someone what Article 2 of the Constitution is not some obscure legal gotcha. There are questions you can ask about bizarre, hidden legal theories that would be a gotcha, that wouldn't be fair. Not knowing what Article 2 of the Constitution is, which is what establishes the president and the executive branch, any first-year law student who didn't know what Article 2 of the Constitution was would flunk con law. And I will say Chairman Durbin subsequently said publicly she was likely to get confirmed. And he went on to say that he thought there were members of this committee who couldn't answer the question Senator Kennedy asked as well. I hope and pray that's not the case. I'm confident that on the Republican side of the aisle, the members of this committee know what Article 2 is. Are there any members of this committee who care to volunteer on the Democrat side of the aisle that you don't know what Article 2 is? If you didn't, you or I or anyone who didn't know what Article 2 was would not be qualified to serve on this committee. And I will say, I want to encourage the Democrats on the committee to follow Chairman Durbin's lead. Chairman Durbin, during the Trump administration, explained on a nominee, he said he invoked what he called the Senator John Kennedy test. And Chairman Durbin said, quote, "I think it's a legitimate test to be applied to all those who want to be trial judges. And I hope others on both sides of the table will join me in saying it's not enough to aspire. You have to bring to this aspiration some practical experience and knowledge that suggests you can meet the standard required." And I just want to close by this, which is urging my colleagues to be willing to stand up to the White House. I'm confident that many, if not most of you, actually care about having a qualified judiciary. One of the things I cannot understand over the last 2 years is every Democrat member of this committee has voted for every single Biden judicial nominee 100% without failing. And I will say on the Senate floor, every Democrat has voted for every Biden judicial nominee. Not a single Democrat in the United States Senate has mustered the courage to vote no on a single nominee. And to be clear, it wasn't that long ago. We had a Republican president and a Republican majority in this body, and there were many of us who said on particular nominees, this is not a good nominee. We're not going to support this nominee. In fact, the John Kennedy test that Chairman Durbin referred to came from a Trump nominee who John Kennedy eviscerated at a hearing in a video that I still liken to watching a car wreck in slow motion. It was painful. But what happened? When it became clear that this individual was not qualified for the position for which he had been nominated, the White House withdrew the nomination. And it did so after a number of us made clear we're not going to support putting an unqualified person on the bench, pull the nomination back. So I would ask members of this committee, is there anyone, if the White House nominates a ham sandwich? I think much of our national media has become wildly politicized on both sides. And many of the national media platforms operate as partisan propaganda outlets. I'd like to see local media expand and proliferate because I think our democracy does better when we have genuine debate from both sides, or even more sides than that. At the same time, I do think the concerns that have been raised by Senator Lee and others are real. And I am not at all convinced that this bill will solve the problem it is intending to solve. And I have at least some concern that the bill may exacerbate the problems that it is ostensibly created to solve. When I look at big tech and when I look at media, I think the single greatest threat we have to free speech is not even the market power of big tech, but it is the wanton abuse of power and the blatant censorship from big tech. Several senators today have said, well, there have been allegations of censorship. Let's be clear, these are not mere allegations. It is unequivocal that big tech is actively censoring speech it disagrees with and is doing so in a wildly partisan manner. we can point to a couple of very specific examples that are recent and in the news. The Biden White House explicitly asked Twitter, will you please ban Alex Berenson, a former reporter for the New York Times. Now, it used to be that Democrats thought the New York Times was a reputable organization. I have some real questions about that, but the fact that Berenson was a New York Times reporter ought to at least have some modicum of credibility that he's a journalist. But in the midst of COVID, Berenson dared question the orthodoxy that was demanded from this administration. The Biden administration demanded of big tech silence this voice because we must have no dissent. And what did Twitter do? Happily complied and said he is banned. Now, mind you, Berenson turned around, sued Twitter, and won. They settled the lawsuit, they reinstated him, and Twitter publicly admitted that what he was saying was not misinformation. Anyone who cares about free speech ought to be troubled with this White House or any others directing big tech, silence journalists who are saying something I don't like. It's not just the Biden White House. We also have had recent revelations that right before the 2020 election, the Federal Bureau of Investigation asked Facebook, take down any stories about the Hunter Biden laptop. Now look, pause for a second. I get there are partisan differences between both sides. And in an election, Republicans like things that help Republicans, Democrats like things that help Democrats. That's the nature of politics. Anyone remotely concerned about free speech or civil liberties ought to be concerned about the FBI asking big tech weeks before an election to take down information because it's politically harmful to the party they want to prevail. And by the way, it's worth underscoring, we now know the Hunter Biden laptop story was true. Not only was it not misinformation, not only was it not Russian misinformation, which is what the FBI falsely claimed, it was true, it was accurate, it was real. Nonetheless, both Facebook and Twitter said take it down, and they demanded of the New York Post, they deplatformed a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton with the fifth largest circulation in the country. They deplatformed the New York Post as long as they kept it up. Now, if you care about journalism, big tech operating at the behest of the FBI to interfere in an election ought to scare the hell out of you. So, when I look at this question, what is preeminent to me is whether this bill is going to increase or decrease censorship. I've got a series of amendments which I intend to offer this morning. And whether I vote yes or no on this bill is going to depend on